The laughter started near the exhibitor tables, somewhere between the prize-winning pumpkins and the livestock pens. Imogen Trevithick stood beside a simple wooden display, 3 glass jars of soil, a hand-drawn chart, and a handful of photographs taken on her family's farm in Shropshire. She had driven 3 hours to be here. She had practiced what she wanted to say for weeks, and the moment she began explaining why her darkest soil sample was actually the most valuable thing on that table, a man in a green waxed jacket crossed his arms and said, loud enough for a small crowd to hear, "She's trying to resurrect dirt that's been dead for 20 years. Somebody else laughed, then another person, then a judge, a man who had grown barley for 4 decades, waved his hand dismissively and walked away without asking a single question. Imogen said nothing. She straightened her chart. She looked back down at her jars. Nobody standing in that exhibition hall could have guessed that within 1 growing season, her farm would become the most talked-about piece of land in the entire county. Nobody could have guessed that those 3 jars of soil would eventually draw researchers, county officials, and the very farmers who had laughed, all walking her fields with notebooks open, full of questions. If you believe that the quietest ideas sometimes change everything, subscribe and join us for more stories like this one. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know. Now let's find out what Imogen understood that everyone else had missed. She grew up on what her grandfather had always called Milford Farm, a 180-acre property that had been in the Trevithick family for 3 generations. By the time Imogen was a teenager, the farm was struggling. Yields had been dropping for nearly a decade. The soil, once a rich dark loam that her grandfather described as alive underfoot, had turned pale and compacted. Water pooled after rain instead of soaking in. Plants germinated slowly and tired young. Her father, Douglas, tried more fertilizer. He tried stronger sprays. He borrowed against the farm to buy equipment. None of it turned the numbers around. The soil kept declining, quietly and persistently, the way things often do when the problem is invisible. Imogen was not studying agricultural science at university. She was studying ecology. And somewhere in her 2nd year, between lectures on forest succession and reading assignments on fungal networks, something clicked. She began spending her summers differently, not fixing machinery, not reviewing chemical schedules, but walking the fields slowly, watching things. She would crouch beside old hedgerows where the soil was darker, crumblier, full of movement. She noticed that wherever the ground held worms, the plants nearby stood taller. She noticed that patches of untouched earth, areas her father had left fallow by accident, seemed strangely vibrant compared to the heavily worked strips beside them. She brought home books that confused her father. She started collecting soil samples and labeling them by location and condition. She began building compost heaps at the far end of the property and seeding cover crops on 3 experimental plots without telling anyone why. Others in the village saw a young woman who didn't quite understand how modern farming worked. What they didn't see was someone who was beginning to understand something far older. That 2nd summer, while turning compost near the back of the property, Imogen met Alistair Pemberton. He was 73, a retired agronomist who had spent decades studying soil health across the British Isles, and he had come to look at the old hedgerow boundaries on the Trevithick property for a historical land use survey. He didn't say much, but when Imogen showed him her sample jars, the pale, compacted soil from the main fields versus the darker, softer material she'd been collecting from the field margins, he studied them for a long time. Then he looked at her and said, "Crops are only ever as healthy as what they can't see." He didn't elaborate. He handed back the jars and walked on toward the hedgerows. Imogen turned the sentence over in her mind for weeks. By the following spring, she had converted 2 of her experimental plots entirely, introducing deep-rooted cover crops like clover and phacelia, applying thick layers of composted material, and reducing tillage to almost nothing. The idea was straightforward, even if it contradicted decades of conventional practice on the farm. Stop disturbing the soil structure, start feeding the biology within it. Soil, she had learned, is not simply a medium for roots to grip, it is an ecosystem. A single tablespoon of healthy earth contains more living organisms than there are people on Earth. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, billions of organisms cycling nutrients, breaking down organic matter, creating the invisible architecture that allows water to move and plants to feed. Earthworms alone can transform compacted clay into something almost sponge-like if given the right conditions. The problem is that this biology is fragile. Heavy tillage destroys fungal networks that took years to form. Synthetic inputs can suppress microbial populations. Bare soil loses organic matter rapidly, eroding in rain and baking in sun. The more the land was pushed, the less life it held, and the less life it held, the harder it became to grow anything without pushing harder still. It was a cycle, and Imogen believed she had found a way to reverse it. She wasn't the first to think so. Regenerative farming had been practiced and preached in various forms for decades, in soil science journals, on experimental farms in the American Midwest, in the notebooks of indigenous communities who had managed land sustainably for centuries without ever calling it by that name. What was new was Imogen applying it quietly and methodically to a specific piece of exhausted Shropshire ground. The county fair was her mother's idea. Harriet Trevithick thought that if Imogen presented her findings publicly, her samples, her data, her photographs of root depth and soil color across the different plots, someone with influence might take notice. Maybe a grant would follow. Maybe other farmers would become curious. What actually happened was the laughter. A group of experienced farmers gathered around her table and politely but firmly explained why her approach wouldn't work. Cover crops, one man said, were expensive and competed with cash crops. Reduced tillage, argued another, led to compaction problems he'd seen firsthand. And compost, at the scale of a commercial farm, the volumes required were simply impractical. Their skepticism was not malicious, it was earned. These were men who had spent lifetimes reading difficult seasons, managing tight margins, surviving things that would have broken other people. They were not cartoon villains. They were farmers who had learned to be cautious of anything that sounded too simple. Imogen listened. She answered questions. She did not raise her voice. When she drove home that evening, she stopped at the edge of the field she'd been working for 18 months and stood there for a while in the early dark. But that wasn't the hardest part of what came next. That spring brought one of the driest stretches the region had seen in 11 years, followed by several weeks of heavy rainfall. For many farms across the county, the combination was punishing. The dry period cracked soil surfaces and stressed shallow root systems. Then the rain arrived faster than compacted ground could absorb, running off in sheets, carrying topsoil into ditches, leaving fields waterlogged for days. 3 neighboring farms reported their worst germination rates in a decade. On Milford Farm, the story was quietly, almost stubbornly different. The cover crops Imogen had seeded throughout the previous autumn had left root channels deep in the soil, pathways that allowed water to travel downward rather than pooling on the surface. The compost applications had increased organic matter enough that the soil held moisture during the dry weeks without losing structure. Earthworm populations had recovered dramatically in the untilled plots, and those same worms had been engineering drainage for months without anyone asking them to. When the county's agricultural inspector, a careful man named Rupert Halsey, drove out to document the rainfall impact across the area, he stopped his Land Rover at the edge of Milford Farm and sat looking for a long time. The crops were standing clean and green, while surrounding fields showed bare patches and runoff scars. He called the University Extension Office that afternoon. Rupert Halsey would later be among the first officials to formally request a tour of her methods. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of lives. Standing in Imogen's field 2 weeks later, watching a group of researchers kneel beside her cover crop residue and dig careful test pits with small spades, the line felt less like a quotation and more like a fact you could hold in your hands. The data confirmed what her eyes had already told her. Organic matter on her restored plots had increased by a full percentage point in 18 months, a number that normally takes years to shift. Microbial biomass was measurably higher. Water infiltration was nearly 3 times the rate of the neighboring compacted fields. The County Fair Committee sent a letter in July. They were hosting an autumn agricultural symposium. They They wanted Imogen Trevithick as the keynote speaker. Alistair Pemberton, who had heard what happened, sent a handwritten note. It said only, "Now you know what the crops were always trying to tell you." At the symposium, no one laughed. The man in the green wax jacket sat in the second row with a notepad. The barley farmer who had walked away without a single question at the fair was there too. This time, he asked for. Harriet sat in the back row and said nothing. She didn't need to. Imogen spoke for 40 minutes. She talked about worms and fungi and organic matter. She talked about the soil restoration skills she had quietly built over 2 years. Not in a classroom, but on her knees in the field, watching and adjusting and learning. She talked about observation, about slowing down enough to see what the land was trying to tell you. She talked about her grandfather's description of soil that felt alive underfoot, and how she had spent 2 years trying to return one field to that feeling. The lesson she left her audience with was not really about soil. It was about patience, about the things that grow best without being rushed, without being shouted about, without shortcuts. The deepest roots, she said, are always the ones nobody notices until the drought comes. Real success, in farming and in life, often begins where nobody thinks to look, beneath the surface, in the quiet, in the dark, doing its work long before anyone arrives to witness the result. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like the video, it helps more people find stories like this one, and we'd love to know, if everyone in the room had laughed at your idea, would you have kept going? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every one.